How difficult is it to integrate in a new culture? It's a question I ask myself. I moved to Sweden almost a year ago from the Netherlands, and although the Netherlands and Sweden have quite some things in common, there's also many differences, and of course many different cultural references. Just a lot of nuances that are common sense to Swedish people, but new to me. In this video series I want to explore how can I get a deeper understanding of Swedish culture. So I'm documenting the process of how I make Sweden my home. The way I want to do this is actually not by vlogging my life, but by showing you a lot of media references along one theme. And for this first video I thought it would be good to actually discuss cultural integration. So I want to start off by showing you a model. It shows 4 stages of cultural adaptation. So the first stage is where you feel it's a honeymoon phase, where everything is nice and you're like, whoa, everything is beautiful and a bit different from what I know. Then the second phase is where you fall into a crisis. This is actually the culture shock. It's where you feel anxiety or confusion because there are some things that feel so slightly different or maybe very different from what you're used to. That feels very uncomfortable. So this phase of disorientation is not very fun. But then luckily people recover and find a way to adjust to this new situation or difference. So I'm not even in Sweden for a year, but I've been thinking a lot about rebuilding my life. A big thing is very practical. For instance, there's a lot of administration and you want to have a new social network and finding your daily routines. Actually, basically just setting up your everyday life in a new place. I think this practical aspect of integrating is not too difficult. I mean, you can find your favorite supermarket, you find a home. Those processes can be hard, but it's very practical that you find a home and a job, social network. There's just practical steps you take along the way. But on an emotional level, I think to really integrate on a deeper level and really feel at home and feel a sense of belonging and feel connected to the people around you, instead of feeling, oh, that's the local Swedish people and this is me, an expat, someone with another cultural background. In my situation, I moved here with the idea that it could be permanent. I also went on an exchange years ago to Sweden, and back then it felt very temporary. I stayed connected with the Netherlands mostly, and I had here my temporary things, but now that's shifting because I'm building my life here and I have the intention to stay. How I think about integrating in a new culture, what it feels to me, this whole process of building my new life here in Sweden actually feels like I missed many years of cultural references. So in my case, I moved after just turning 30. So it feels like I missed 30 years of Swedish culture and context, or knowing what's going on here. I'm thinking this way, if I really want to understand Swedish people in my age group, then it's nice if I can also understand okay, what is their feeling of nostalgia? What are just some political facts or big events that they still might refer to or that were big in Swedish culture? Or what is common sense or general knowledge that they have and that are just blind spots to me? And right now I actually sort of made it my hobby to understand all those nuances, or do my homework and catch up on all those things I missed. My way of doing this is by consuming a lot of Swedish media and find all those nuances and subtle things that can make me feel closer to this place and this culture and the people living here. And of course without losing myself, because I think there's also limits to adaptation. It might be difficult to eventually find a good balance between, okay, this is my background and this is my new place. You might feel always like an outsider, because I think nostalgia is a big element in this actually. So for instance, I can learn about Swedish cultures. For instance, when Swedish people watch Donald Duck, a specific episode or film of Donald Duck on Christmas Day, and they do this for years now. And of course I can start doing that on Christmas Day, watch this Donald Duck with millions of other Swedish people, but I will not have this nostalgic feeling simply because I didn't do this as a child, or I didn't do this with my family and have this feeling. And yeah, sure, I could build up a certain level of nostalgia maybe if I start doing this now and then do it for the next 10 years or something, and maybe I would then get a sense of nostalgia connected to Donald Duck on Christmas Day. I think those are some limitations. Your childhood memories are very specific, or TV shows you watched, or yeah, and so on. But at least I'm trying to get closer to it, because I really think and believe that it will help me with integrating and with feeling more at home here. So I think another part of society that I might better understand if I know some more cultural references is humor. For instance, when people make jokes or, refer to something that happened in the past, or refer to a very specific event or people or show or so on, then it's nice to be able to understand that. And I think it's also very helpful when going to theater or reading books and really understanding some of those nuances in order to get the joke. I have an example of this. I was watching a TV show, it's called Trevlig Helg. In the show, it's a show full of sketches, and then suddenly Grinet showed up, and she actually used to have her own show for teenagers, and a lot of people feel have some nostalgia attached to that show. So they would immediately recognize her. Because I watched that children's show, I recognized her in this show, and I really like that, because otherwise it would just be a blind spot or I wouldn't get it. And I was like, oh yeah, that's interesting. So to me, finding out those things is very fun. A Swedish TV series that I watched that is actually related to cultural integration is Flykten till Östermalm. It's a show about a Kurdic family. They somehow get like millions of Swedish crowns. The man, the dad and the family, he decides that he wants to become part of this upper class in Östermalm, so the most rich people that were born in very rich families. And this man thinks like, yeah, I have a lot of money now, so I am part of this group and I can become part of this group. And in every episode you see him struggling or trying to adapt to their culture by, for instance, adjusting his language or understanding a very complex abstract art or starting to play golf and so on. What was interesting to me is that actually I thought, yeah, that is maybe the feeling that I have now in a smaller degree, because he hit a wall every time. Like, he could try to copy them, but he could never become part of them because he wasn't born in the situation. And I think that if you integrate in a new culture, it can feel a bit like that. Yes, you can become part, but then just as I try to explain with the nostalgia, there might be limitation in how far you can get, simply because you still have another background. And this man in the show, they made fun of this upper class, obviously. He was being denied many times simply because he didn't have an upper class name. So by looking at Flykten till Östermalm, I actually recognize this awkwardness. You're trying to copy the nuances, but then there's still some nuances you just simply don't get, or might take a lot of time to really understand, like certain social codes or way of speaking, or because naturally you just do it differently because you're just used to live in another context. I've also been listening to a podcast called Jag är svensk. It's a podcast by two friends who have different cultural backgrounds. Every episode they invite a guest and they talk about a very specific element of Swedish culture. For instance, food, or like Can you be Swedish when you don't look Swedish? So they really talk about how to deal with having multiple cultures and how to combine them and how to feel a sense of belonging in Sweden. In one episode there was a guest, I believe he was American and also Swedish, and he said something like, oh yeah, the time where I feel most Swedish is when I visit Norway. And I thought that was very interesting because Norway and Sweden are a bit similar, and then that his Swedishness becomes most visible when he's in another culture that is a bit similar to Sweden. I thought that was a very interesting comment. If you happen to see this video, thank you. I'm looking forward to document this process a bit more. So yeah, I keep you posted.